We have arrived at a time when starting a steroid cycle is as natural as buying a gym pass. And this doesn't just apply to advanced strength athletes who have been bodybuilding naturally and decided to switch to the other side to bench a few more kilos. Unfortunately, more and more younger bodybuilding adepts are choosing the cycle, and the use of steroids is being trivialized to such an extent that the hardcore cycle of a 14-year-old is not seen as an isolated case of extreme degeneration, but as a general phenomenon, a natural occurrence. Whether we like it or not, we can see social media as the main culprit for its popularization among young boys. Because while on the one hand it is an excellent platform for sharing thoughts, views, and training tips, on the other it is leading to unnaturally achieved silhouettes entering the mainstream in large quantities, pushing the boundaries of an appropriate level of muscularity far closer to the shape presented in the classic physique scene. This process didn't start suddenly either, but over the years of global access to the internet, the characteristics of a good physique have gradually evolved. It's not even about the doped people themselves who advertise their muscularity on Instagram or TikTok, but about the fact that people in the industry post photos online. Let's be honest, if someone shares a photo of their body that they've worked hard for in the gym and also watches their diet and takes care of all other aspects, then they're not just going to upload a random photo with a bare torso in poor light that was taken at a barbecue. If such a person is truly passionate, then it means that they really care about these things, and if they are already posting something, then they will make sure that their pumped up body looks as good as possible in a good light. If we now apply this pattern to the fitness community as a whole, we have the obvious result that the online propagation of really good figures is increasing significantly, meaning that the boundaries of good muscle are shifting. You might think that this is a good thing in general, as it means that our environment is constantly evolving and, as in most sports, each following generation is better than the last.
Stop it!
Unfortunately, professional sport has its own rules, and the vast majority of us fitness freaks are not bodybuilders, while the characteristics of good form are often at a professional level. While mature, adult people understand this phenomenon and realize themselves that they don't have to worry about their physique not being enough to go viral on the internet, young people often lack patience, so they make more impulsive decisions. It can be hard for them to accept that all the actors on TikTok or Instagram have biceps of over 40 centimeters, while their own skinny arms are only good for ballroom dancing, even though they have been training for a few months. For many young people who have just begun the beautiful journey of strength training, the decision to enter the cycle is as easy as choosing the first beer of their life. I have some doubts in general, but what's the worst that can happen? Of course, the use of steroids by young people is not a dark invention of our time. I would take the liberty of saying that as soon as steroids appeared in pharmacies, they were often taken by people who were far too young. Kurt Marnul, Arnold Schwarzenegger's first trainer when he was still living in Austria, said that he personally gave him his first dose of steroids when his pupil was only 15 years old. That was in the 60s, long before the internet was generally accessible. So, can we conclude that nothing has changed since then? Not really, because bodybuilding used to be an extremely niche sport, so there were correspondingly fewer potential users. Now, with the popularization of weight training, there are many more people practicing this sport, and therefore the number of potential users of banned substances is also increasing. In an episode about the epidemic of burnt-out brains, I take a closer look at the potential dangers of steroid use. Since harmful changes in the body after taking steroids are a fact of life, it's even more important to think about the potential negative consequences for a teenager who decides to ease their way to big gains with a cycle. Of course, the side effects don't necessarily affect everyone to the same extent, and that is true for teenagers too. But taking steroids at the age of 14 in the hope that the consequences will pass you by is extremely idiotic when you consider the devastation they can cause to a young body. Let's first take a look at their effects on a teenager's mental state. First and foremost, they often worsen the mood swings that are already common during the hormonal storm of the teenage years. An increase in aggression and the possibility of dangerous behavior for the adolescent in the cycle and those around them, because an emotionally unstable adolescent loaded with testosterone is a time bomb that can explode at any time. In general, taking steroids certainly does not help to improve self-control, especially at a young age. Now, let's take a look at the general side effects on the body and the organism as a whole. It is well known that an increase in muscle mass is the most desirable consequence of the dark side of the force, along with increased self-confidence, but even that alone comes with some risks. Gaining strength too quickly on the cycle can result in a young person's joints and tendons not being able to withstand impacts that should not normally occur. If a young person who is not particularly familiar with strength training gains weight and strength quickly without the guidance of an experienced person, the risk of injury increases. From there, it's only a short way to injury, and catching serious damage before the body has really fully developed is definitely a bad scenario. The aging of a teenager on doping by losing some hair on the head is an obvious consequence even for advanced users. A teenager who looks like a grown man at the age of 16 is such an example. Of course, it can happen that someone has a predisposition for the so-called masculine appearance, and with the boosted testosterone in puberty, more quickly achieves the features that are generally considered masculine, such as a very deep voice or receding hairline. But this is certainly a minority, and hardly any 16-year-old who does not take doping looks like his own father. In addition, undesirable skin changes can occur, although it should be kept in mind that people in puberty often already have problems with increased sebaceous gland activity and sebum overproduction, for which an increased androgen level in the blood during puberty is responsible. Furthermore, the intake of hormone-altering substances into the body can cause, among other things, a reduction in the size of the testicles and a decrease in sperm count, as well as the appearance of breasts among young boys. Furthermore, the substance can have a negative impact on the process of puberty, and thus affect the growth of the young body due to the premature disappearance of the epiphyseal cartilage. In the normal process of bone growth, the epiphyseal cartilages turn into bone at the very end, whereas if this happens too early, the youngster may not grow as tall as Mother Nature intended for him. This is a series of consequences that are quite understandable to anyone with even a slight interest in the subject. However, steroids can trigger an avalanche of negative consequences in a young body that can leave their mark for the rest of their lives, even after stopping taking the stuff. A less obvious consequence of adolescent steroid use can be the tendency of young people to try all kinds of stimulants on themselves. For example, starting a cycle at the age of 14 can trigger a craving for stronger stimulants. I show in another video how tragic the consequences of the combination of doping and drugs can be. One example of the abuse of needles is 14-year-old influencer Cody Kopa, who claims in his videos on TikTok that steroids are an essential element for getting in shape. The boy has followed the example of other toxic influencers such as Togi and shows how he uses steroids in his videos. You might think that this is a provocation and the boy is just making it up to become popular, but if we look at his physique in the videos where he shows his old and current shape, we see that the difference is huge. Also, in the older videos you can see that we are dealing with a child, whereas over the course of a year he has made a very significant transformation into a practically grown-up guy. On the one hand, it is well known that at this age you can grow just by looking at a dumbbell, but in this case the difference seems to be too obvious. Despite the fact that the boy already clearly had good genetics for bodybuilding, we can safely assume that he is taking anabolic steroids because the size, shape, and quality of muscle he presents is not something you achieve after a year of training and a creatine cycle of several months. Interestingly, the influencer states that the only side effect of taking them in his case is muscle mass, while videos of him in bodybuilding poses clearly show an alarming rash on his face, chest, and back. And these are just the side effects that can be seen at first glance, but the havoc the steroids have caused in his young body is still a big unknown. Another example is Raul Ramirez, an influencer who some time ago showed off his seemingly spectacular transformation between the ages of 13 and 17. He gained 50 kilos of pure muscle mass and increased his arm circumference by 22 centimeters. He didn't admit to taking steroids, which is an obvious lie, but he didn't claim to be a natural either. He simply avoided the subject, but that doesn't change the fact that he must have supplied himself with anabolic steroids, and in a big way the only question is how early he started, because from his explanation it can be concluded that he had his first encounter with a needle at the age of 13. As for the visible consequences, in some photos of his transformation, his skin looks like sandpaper or the breadcrumbs on a Wiener Schnitzel, with a large number of pimples and red spots. His face has also visibly changed, which has aged him by around 15 years in a very short space of time. It also happens that stuff directly contributes to the death of a young athlete. The story of Luke O'Brien, whose death at the age of 17 was caused by taking Winstrol, is an example of this. The boy wanted to improve his performance and needed a booster to help him train harder. He certainly did not expect the drug to cause a rare side effect, namely brain swelling, which the pathologist who carried out the autopsy identified as the cause of the 17-year-old's death and blamed on steroids. Many young people just starting out in weightlifting take the shorter route. They are inspired by the toxic messages of older colleagues in the fitness industry who often no longer even lie by pretending to be natural, but openly claim that steroids are a miracle invention that minimizes the path to the desired goal. Unfortunately, doping at such a young age can also shorten the path to premature death or at least serious health problems. It's important to be aware of the negative consequences of this path and to warn young people that 90% of the time, no matter how much the talking heads on the internet tell them the benefits of taking dope, nothing good will come from getting into this cycle as a teenager. So, is it worth the risk to be in the remaining 10%? If you're at that age and are hesitant to turn to the dark side of the force, take several breaths in and out, calm down, and think of far safer solutions.